I've written hundreds of obituaries, but no subject ever walked into my office asking why I buried her alive. Vivienne Ashford was Manhattan's ice queen. I uncovered the loneliness behind her mask and poured my soul into her tribute. I thought it was just a eulogy, but as she stared me down, I realized I hadn't written a death notice. I had accidentally written her a love letter.
And she knew it.
Claire Bennett had written 217 obituaries in her career, but she had never once had one of them walk into her office, demanding to know why she was being buried alive. The phone rang at 7:14 on a Tuesday morning, which was already a bad sign. Claire was still in her bathrobe, her hair in a messy bun, and she had just poured the first cup of coffee that was supposed to be the only conversation she needed before noon. Marta's name lit up the screen. Marta never called before 9 unless someone important had died. "Tell me you're sitting down," Marta said. "I'm standing. That's worse, isn't it?" "Babe, I need you to hear me without screaming." There was a pause, the kind Marta only took when she was about to deliver news that required a lawyer. "The obit you wrote for Vivienne Ashford? The one I told you to make warm and human and not too long?" Claire's stomach dropped. "It ran. You told me it ran. It ran. It's running. It's in 3 papers and it's trending on social media because apparently the subject of your beautiful, heartfelt, deeply moving obituary is not dead." The coffee cup hit the counter. Claire stared at the wall in her tiny Brooklyn apartment, at the corkboard covered in old newspaper clippings and photographs of cats she had named, and tried to compute what Marta had just said. Vivienne Ashford, CEO of Ashford Media Group, the ice queen of Manhattan, the woman who had built a media empire out of nothing and then bought the buildings that used to house her competitors. Not dead. "That's impossible," Claire said. "I did research. I spent a week on that piece. I interviewed 3 sources. I found the yearbook photo. I wrote about her first startup." "You wrote about her first startup? Honey, she launched that startup when she was 25. She's 36 now. Did it not occur to you that a woman that powerful might, I don't know, still be walking around?" Claire pressed her hand to her forehead. The obituary had been beautiful. That was the problem. She had poured her whole heart into it, the way she always did, because that was the only way she knew how to write about a life. She had written about Vivienne Ashford's rise from a girl in a brownstone to the top of the New York media world. She had written about her mother's death when she was 17, about the way she had thrown herself into work like a soldier into battle. She had written, with particular care, about a detail she had found in an old interview, that on the night her first company failed, she had sat alone on a pier in Red Hook and eaten an entire birthday cake by herself, because it was her 20th birthday and no one had remembered. Claire had cried when she wrote that part. She always cried when she wrote about lonely people doing brave things. "I need to fix this," Claire said. "You need to pray that Vivienne Ashford has a sense of humor," Marta replied, "because her publicist just called me, and she is not laughing." The call that came an hour later was from a number Claire didn't recognize. She was at her desk by then, still in yesterday's jeans and a sweater she had worn twice that week, trying to figure out how to unring a bell that could not be unrung. She answered because she was too panicked to screen calls. "Ms. Bennett?" The voice was low, measured, and carried the kind of authority that made Claire sit up straighter without meaning to. "This is Vivienne Ashford. I believe you've been writing about me." Claire made a sound that was not a word. It was somewhere between a gasp and a whimper and a very quiet scream. "I think like to meet," Vivienne continued. "In person, my office, 2:00. I assume you know where that is, given how thoroughly you researched my life." The line went dead before Claire could say anything, not even the automatic apology that was already forming on her tongue. She sat there in the silence of her apartment, surrounded by her clippings and her cat photos and the half-empty mug of now-cold coffee, and felt the full weight of what she had done. She had written a eulogy for a woman who was very much alive, and now that woman wanted to see her. The Ashford Media Group headquarters was a glass tower in Midtown that made Claire feel like an ant in a museum. She had never been inside a building that tall, and the elevator ride felt like ascending into a cloud of money and silence. The receptionist on the top floor looked at Claire's cardigan and messy ponytail with the kind of polite disdain that only New York could produce,
and gestured toward a set of double doors without saying a word. Claire's hands were sweating. She had brought a folder of research, as if that would help, as if she could somehow prove that she had only written what she had found. The doors opened. Vivienne Ashford was not what Claire had expected. She was taller than the photos suggested, or perhaps it was the way she carried herself, shoulders back, chin lifted, as if she had never once in her life apologized for taking up space. She wore a black blazer that cost more than Claire's monthly rent. Her hair was dark, cut sharp at the jaw, and her eyes were the color of winter. She did not smile. "Ms. Bennett," she said, and her voice was exactly as it had been on the phone. Measured, controlled. "I read your obituary." Claire opened her mouth. What came out was, "I'm so sorry." "Are you?" "Because."
"See, I've been told it's very beautiful. People keep sending me excerpts. My lawyers are having a field day, but my publicist called it a surprisingly tender piece of writing." Vivienne tilted her head, studying Claire like a specimen. "You wrote that I understood the weight of loneliness, that I never dismissed the silence in others. Where did you get that from?" Claire swallowed. This was the moment. She could lie or deflect or pretend she had made it up for artistic effect, but she had never been good at lying, and the truth was already sitting on her tongue. "There's an interview," she said quietly. "From when you were 20, you told the reporter that on the night your first company folded, you sat on a pier in Red Hook and ate an entire birthday cake by yourself, because it was your birthday, and no one had remembered." She paused. "I wrote that you understood loneliness because you had lived it. I didn't mean it as an insult. I meant it as the truest thing I knew about you." The room went very quiet. Vivienne's expression did not change, but something in her eyes flickered. A crack in the ice, so small that Claire almost missed it. It was there and then gone, replaced by the same polished mask that had greeted her at the door. "You wrote me a love letter," Vivienne said, her voice flat. "And called it a death notice." Claire blinked. What? "You wrote about my mother. You wrote about my birthday. You wrote about my loneliness." Vivienne stepped closer, and Claire caught the faint scent of cold perfume and something else, something softer. "Nobody writes about those things unless they care. And you don't even know me." Claire's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it at her ease. She wanted to explain, to say that it was just her dupe, that she wrote about everyone that way, that she had cried over a stranger's cake on a pier in Red Hook because that was how she was made, but the words wouldn't come. Vivienne was looking at her now with an expression Claire couldn't name. Not anger, exactly. Something more complicated. "I want a retraction," Vivienne said finally. "A public statement. A correction. I want you to tell the world that I am not dead, and that the woman who wrote my obituary is very, very mistaken." Claire nodded, still unable to speak. "And Ms. Bennett," Vivienne added, her voice dropping to something almost gentle, "the next time you write about me, I'd prefer you wait until I'm actually gone." She said it like a joke, but there was no smile behind it. Claire saw the crack again, the tiniest fracture in the perfect architecture of Vivienne Ashford's face, and she understood something she couldn't have explained if her life depended on it. Vivienne Ashford was not cold. She was just very, very good at pretending she didn't feel anything at all. The elevator ride down felt like falling. Claire stood in the glass box with her folder pressed against her chest and replayed the conversation over and over, looking for the moment she had done something wrong, the moment she had made it worse. She had written about a stranger's cake and a stranger's loneliness, and the stranger had looked at her like she had seen something no one was supposed to see. She stepped out onto the street, into the cold Manhattan air, and realized her hands were shaking. She had written Vivienne Ashford an obituary, and somewhere in the middle of it she had also written her a love letter. She hadn't meant to. She barely knew how to explain it to herself, but the crack was there, in both of them, and Claire had a feeling that neither of them was going to be able to ignore it for long. The next morning, Claire woke up to a text from Marta that made her stomach drop. "Vivienne Ashford's office called. You have a meeting, 11 a.m., don't be late, and for God's sake wear something that isn't beige." Claire stared at the message for a full minute. She had spent the night replaying the conversation in Vivienne's office, and now the sequel was being scheduled without her consent. She sat up, pressed her palms against her eyes, and tried to convince herself that this was just a professional follow-up. A formality. A signature on a retraction form, maybe two. She wore a pale blue sweater instead of beige. It felt like a small act of defiance, though she couldn't have said who she was defying. The Ashford Media Building was a glass tower in Midtown that caught the morning light like a blade. Claire rode the elevator to the 32nd floor for the second time in 24 hours, and the woman at the reception desk recognized her immediately. The woman's smile was polite but sharp around the edges, like she had been briefed on who Claire was and why she was here. "Ms. Bennett," she said, "Ms. Ashford is expecting you. This way." Vivienne's office was exactly as Claire remembered it, all clean lines and expensive silence, with the Manhattan skyline pressing against the windows like a held breath. Vivienne stood by the glass wall with her back to the door, one hand in her pocket, the other holding a sheet of paper that Claire recognized with a sickening lurch. It was the obituary, her obituary printed from the website, complete with the photograph of Vivienne in a dark suit, unsmiling. "Good morning," Vivienne said without turning around. Her voice was calm, controlled. "I read it, in last night, twice, actually." Claire's mouth went dry. "I'm so sorry. I know I already apologized, but I—" "Sit down, Claire." It was the first time Vivienne had said her name. Claire sat. The leather chair was too deep and too expensive, and she felt like a child who had wandered into an adult's meeting. Vivienne turned around and walked over to the desk. She didn't sit behind it. Instead, she pulled out the chair across from Claire and sat down, close enough that Claire could smell her perfume. Something clean. Something that cost more than Claire's entire wardrobe. "The retraction is being drafted by my legal team," Vivienne said, setting the printed obituary on the desk between them. "You'll receive a copy for review. I'll need you to sign it, and I'll need your editor to run it in the same slot as the original piece." "Of course. I already talked to Marta, and she—" "I don't care what Marta wants." Vivienne's voice was flat, but not unkind. "I need to know what you want, Claire. Because this piece didn't read like a mistake." Claire blinked. "I'm sorry?" Vivienne tapped the paper with one manicured nail. "This obituary. It's not a list of accomplishments. It's not a timeline of my career. It's not even accurate in places, which my team has helpfully pointed out in red ink." She flipped the page over, revealing a margin covered in cramped red annotations. "But it's the most careful thing anyone has written about me in a decade." The silence between them stretched. Claire could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic 32 floors below. "I don't know how to respond to that," Claire admitted quietly. "You don't have to." Vivienne leaned back slightly and something in her posture softened. Just a fraction. Just enough for Claire, think, to notice. "I asked you here because I wanted to understand something. The cake detail. The one about Red Hook. My 20th birthday." Claire's heart started beating faster. "It was in an interview you did, a long time ago, for a business magazine that went under. I found it in an archive." "I remember that interview." Vivienne's voice was quieter now. "I remember lying to the reporter. I told her the cake was a celebration. I told her I ate it alone because I wanted to, because I was taking a moment to enjoy my own company." "That's not what you wrote in the obituary," Claire said softly. She wasn't sure where the courage came from. "You wrote that I was alone. You wrote that I ate the whole thing by myself, and that I didn't cry until after the last bite." Claire swallowed. "I've been writing obituaries for 6 years, Ms. Ashford. People lie in interviews all the time, but they never lie about the small things. The details they mention in passing, the ones they think don't matter, those are the ones that are always true." Vivienne looked at her for a long moment. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something moving beneath the surface, something that looked almost like recognition. "You wrote that I understood the weight of loneliness," Vivienne said finally. "You wrote that I never took anyone's silence lightly." "Yes. Why?" Claire took a breath. "Because it's true, and because I think you've spent a very long time making sure no one ever notices that about you." The words hung in the air. Vivienne didn't move. She didn't blink. For a second, Claire was terrified she had gone too far. And then, Vivienne did something unexpected. She smiled. It was a small, wry, almost involuntary thing, like a crack in a dam that had been holding for years. "You're dangerous," Vivienne said quietly. "Do you know that?" "I'm really not," Claire said. "I'm the least dangerous person I know. I cried in the bathroom after our meeting yesterday. Vivienne's eyebrows lifted. Did you? Twice. Claire felt her cheeks flush. I don't know why I told you that. Please forget I said it. I won't forget, Vivienne said, and there was something in her voice that made Claire's stomach do a slow, complicated turn. The meeting went on for another 20 minutes. Vivienne walked her through the retraction process with the efficiency of someone who had managed crises 100 times. Claire nodded, took notes, agreed to everything. But underneath the professional talk, something else was happening. Every time their eyes met, it lingered a half-second longer than necessary. Every time Vivienne said her name, it sounded less like an address and more like a discovery. At the door, Claire paused. Ms. Ashford? Vivienne said. If you're going to keep writing about me, you should at least use my first name. Claire's heart skipped. I'm not going to keep writing about you. The retraction. People who write obituaries, Vivienne interrupted, always end up writing about the living eventually. It's in their blood. She tilted her head, studying Claire with those sharp, unreadable eyes. I suspect you'll write about me again. When I'm dead. Or before. She said it lightly, but Claire heard the weight underneath. She heard the invitation, too. The possibility that this wasn't the end of their interaction, but the beginning of something neither of them had named yet. Claire walked out of the office, through the reception area, and into the elevator. Only when the doors closed did she realize she was holding her breath. She had come to fix a missed sink. Instead, she had left with the feeling that she had started something, and Vivienne Ashford, the ice queen of Manhattan, had let her. The letter took Claire 3 hours to write. She started it on her laptop, deleted it, started again on paper, crumpled the page, and finally settled on the kitchen counter with a fountain pen she had not used since college. Her cat, a gray stray she had named Marmalade because he was the opposite of orange, sat on the edge of the counter and watched her with the judgmental patience only cats possess. Don't look at me like that, Claire muttered. This is harder than it sounds. Marmalade blinked, unimpressed. The first draft was too formal. The second was too emotional. The third read like a legal document, which was somehow worse than both. Claire set the pen down and pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to remember exactly what Vivienne's face had looked like when she said, "This is the most thoughtfully written piece about me in 10 years. There had been something underneath the words, a crack in the ice, a flicker of something that looked almost like loneliness. Claire picked up the pen again. By midnight, she had written 2 things. The first was a letter, short, honest, and free of the word sorry because she had said it too many times already and it had started to lose its meaning. The second was something she had not planned to write. A corrected version of the obituary, though corrected felt like the wrong word. It was a different kind of text entirely. Not a death notice, a living notice, she titled it. Simply, to a woman who is still here. And then she wrote about Vivienne Ashford, the way she would write about someone she hoped to know for a long time. The Ashford Media Building at 7:30 in the morning was a different world from the one Claire had seen 2 days before. No executives in tailored suits hurrying through the lobby. No cameras, no security guards with earpieces. Just a young woman at the front desk, with a half-empty cup of coffee and a stack of papers she was clearly not reading. Claire approached the desk, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had rehearsed this moment in the shower, on the subway, and again on the sidewalk outside the building. And still, when the receptionist looked up, every rehearsed line evaporated. "I have something for Vivienne Ashford," Claire said, her voice coming out higher than she intended. "For her office. It's personal." The receptionist raised an eyebrow. "Personal? Personal in a professional way?" Claire winced. That sounded worse. "It's a letter. And a document? She'll know what it's about. I'd rather not leave my name." The receptionist studied her for a long moment. Claire was acutely aware of her own appearance. Yesterday's cardigan, hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail, dark circles she had not bothered to conceal. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had spent the night writing to a stranger about the weight of her own loneliness. "Leave it here," the receptionist said, gesturing to a tray on the corner of the desk. "I'll make sure her assistant gets it." Claire hesitated. The envelope felt heavy in her hands. It was just paper. Just words,
but somehow it also felt like a piece of herself she was about to hand over without any guarantee it would be treated gently. "Thank you," she said, and set it down. She turned and walked out of the lobby before she could change her mind. The morning air hit her face, cold and sharp, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing it in. Whatever happened,
Think, then stray. She had done the right thing. She had to believe that. Vivienne Ashford did not check her messages that morning. She had a board meeting at 9, a budget review at 10:30, and a private call with her father at noon that she had been dreading since Sunday. She moved through her office with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned long ago that stopping meant feeling. And feeling was not a luxury she could afford. It was Marta, not Vivienne's assistant, but the person who handled the front desk deliveries when the regular courier was running late, who placed the envelope on Vivienne's desk at 11:40. It was unremarkable. Cream-colored paper, no return address, her name written in careful, looping cursive that looked almost old-fashioned. "Left by a woman this morning," Marta said. "No name. Said it was personal in a professional way, which is weird, so I thought you'd want to see it." Vivienne waited until Marta left to open it. The letter was short, 3 paragraphs. No apology, which surprised her. No excuses either. Just a quiet, honest explanation that the obituary had been a mistake born of a journalist's trust in an unreliable source, and that the writer had not meant to cause harm. And then, at the bottom, a line that Vivienne read 3 times before she understood it. "I wrote about the person the news told me you were. That was my mistake. The person you actually are deserves better words than I gave you." Vivienne set the letter down. She stared at it for a long moment, aware that her chest felt tight in a way it had not felt in years. The second piece of paper was folded beneath the letter. She pulled it out. "A living notice," it said at the top. Not an obituary, something entirely different. She read the first line, and then she read it again, because her eyes were doing something strange. The coffee in her hand went cold. The city outside her window kept moving, and Vivienne Ashford, the ice queen of Manhattan, sat very still in her leather chair, reading words about herself that did not describe a CEO, or an empire, or a legacy. They described a woman who had once sat alone on a dock and eaten an entire birthday cake, because she had no one to share it with. And the woman who wrote those words had written them with something Vivienne had not let herself feel in 17 years. Tenderness. She did not cry. She had forgotten how, but she pressed her palm flat against the page, as if she could feel the warmth of the hand that had written it, and she let herself sit with the weight of being seen for a full, silent minute. Then she put the papers in the top drawer of her desk, locked it, and went to her 12:30 meeting with a face that betrayed nothing. But that night, after the last call ended and the office lights went dark, she opened the drawer again. She read the living notice twice more, and when she finally turned off her lamp and drove home through the quiet streets of Manhattan, she found that she could not stop thinking about the woman who wrote it, and what it might cost her to have written something so honest. Claire. The letter had not been signed, but Vivienne knew. She had known the moment she read the first line. She just did not know what to do with the knowledge yet. The email arrived at 9 in the morning, and Claire almost spilled her coffee when she saw the sender's name. From V. Ashford at ashfordmedia.com. Subject: Fact check Ms. Bennett. Several details in your, shall we say, creative interpretation of my life require clarification. My assistant will send you a list of times. Faked I am available today. I expect this matter to be handled with the same care you applied to my obituary. Regards, V. Ashford. Claire stared at the screen. There was no anger in the words, no threat of legal action, just a clinical, almost polite demand for a meeting. That was somehow worse. She wrote back with trembling fingers. "Of course, whatever you need, I mean it." She typed, "I mean it," before she could stop herself, then spent the next 3 minutes debating whether to delete it. She did not delete it. At 4:30 that afternoon, she stood outside the 38th floor conference room with a folder of notes she did not need, in a heart rate she could not control. Marta had texted her an hour earlier, "If she kills you, can I have your desk, also your coffee mug, also your cat?" Claire had not answered. The door opened before she could knock. Vivienne stood there in a charcoal blazer, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hair loose in a way the magazine covers never showed. She looked tired. She also looked, Claire noticed, with a strange pang, like someone who had not expected to smile in a long time. "You're on time," Vivienne said. There was no warmth in it, but there was no ice either, just observation. "I'm always on time," Claire said, then winced. "I mean, for things, usually." Vivienne stepped aside. "Come in." The office was bigger than Claire had imagined, but it was not the cold, glassy palace she'd pictured. There were books stacked on the floor, a coat draped over the back of a chair, a small cactus on the windowsill that someone had clearly forgotten to water. And in the corner, half hidden behind a potted fern, was a machine that made Claire stop breathing for half a second. An old typewriter. A royal, if she had to guess, cream-colored keys, a ribbon, a spool that had seen better decades. "You have a typewriter," Claire said. It came out softer than she intended, almost reverent. Vivienne's hand paused over a stack of papers. It was my mother's. The words hung in the air for a moment. Vivienne did not elaborate. She gestured to a chair and Claire sat, and for a while they went through the motions of the fact-check. Did Claire know she was born in Boston? No, she had written New York. Correction noted. Did she know her father was a professor of economics, not a banker? That one hurt a little. Claire had written, "A man who believed in numbers more than people." Vivienne read it aloud, then paused and said, "Actually, that one is accurate. Leave it." Claire looked up. Vivienne was not looking at her. She was looking at the page, her thumb pressing against the edge like she was holding something fragile. They went on, fact by fact, correction by correction. The conversation was professional, clipped, efficient. And yet Vivienne did not end the meeting. She offered coffee. She asked Claire if she was still writing the cat column. She mentioned, almost idly, that her assistant had shown her a piece about a three-legged tabby in Williamsburg, and that it had made her laugh for the first time that week. "You wrote that one," Vivienne said. "Didn't you?" It was not a question. Claire's throat tightened. "Yes." Vivienne nodded slowly. Then she looked out the window at the Manhattan skyline and her voice changed. It became smaller, quieter, the voice of a woman who was not performing. "You wrote in the obituary that I understand the weight of solitude, that I never dismiss another person's silence, because I know what it is to be alone." Claire's heart knocked against her ribs. She had written that. She had meant to cling him. She had not expected Vivienne to read it out loud. In this office, at this hour, with the sunset bleeding gold across the towers outside. "I don't know if I deserve that," Vivienne said, still not looking at her. "I don't know if I've ever been that kind of person. I think I've just been alone for so long that I got good at pretending it was a choice." Claire said nothing. The silence stretched. It was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that two people hold together, careful not to break it. Then Vivienne turned from the window, and for a moment her face was unguarded. She looked, Claire thought, like someone who had forgotten how to be seen and was trying to remember. "You said, 'I know the weight of solitude,'" Vivienne repeated. "I don't. I'm still learning. I've been learning for 20 years and I'm not there yet." The air in the room changed. Claire could feel it, the way you feel a storm coming in your chest before the sky turns. She wanted to reach out. She did not. She held very still instead. "That's okay," Claire said quietly. "You don't have to know it all at once. You don't have to know it alone." Vivienne looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes were dark, unreadable, but something in them had softened. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then said almost against her will, "You should go. It's late." Claire stood. She gathered her folder. She was at the door when Vivienne spoke again. "Claire," she turned. Vivienne was standing by a window, backlit by the final orange light, her silhouette sharp and unbelievably small for someone the whole city called an ice queen. "The letter," Vivienne said. Her voice was rough. "The one without a name. And the other thing, the living notice." Claire's breath stopped. "I read them," Vivienne said. "I think them more than once. And I want you to know that She stopped, swallowed, started again. "I want you to know that no one has ever written anything that made me feel like that. Like I was being seen instead of looked at." Claire's eyes burned. She blinked hard. "I mean it," she said. Vivienne's lips curved. It was not quite a smile, but it was close. It was the first real expression Claire had seen on her face that did not have a wall in front of it. "I know," Vivienne said. "That's the problem." She looked at Claire for another long second, then turned back to the window. "My assistant will email you the list of remaining corrections," she said, her voice returning to its usual register. "We'll schedule another meeting. There are still a few details that need, careful handling." Claire knew there were not. She also knew she would come anyway. "I'll be there," she said. She walked out into the hallway and stood very still for a moment, one hand pressed against her chest, trying to remember how to breathe. The office door stayed open behind her. She did not look back, but she felt, all the way down the elevator, all the way out onto the street, all the way home to Brooklyn, the weight of Vivienne's gaze still resting on the back of her neck. Like a hand she had not been given, like a promise she had not been brave enough to ask for. 3 days passed before Claire heard from Vivienne again. She told herself she was not waiting. She wrote a piece about a retired firefighter in Queens who had planted a community garden on a vacant lot, and she only checked her phone 17 times while doing it. Marta noticed. Marta always noticed. "Babe," Marta said, hovering over Claire's desk with a mug of coffee. "An obit is not a love letter, but a woman who emails you at 4:30 to verify facts and then keeps you until 7 p.m. is definitely not verifying facts." Claire did not dignify that with a response. She also did not stop checking her phone. On the 4th morning, the email came. It was short, which felt like a signature in itself. "I read your piece about the stray cats in Fort Greene. You write about them more vividly than you wrote about me. There is a colony behind the old bottling plant on Vanderbilt. I checked, they are still there. If you want to see them, I will be there at 6 p.m. VA. Claire read it 4 times. Then she read it again, slower. The way you read a sentence that might change something. She had written that cat column 8 months ago, buried in the back pages of the Brooklyn Ledger. She had almost forgotten it. Vivienne had not. Vivienne had gone looking for the cats. At 5:40 p.m., Claire stood outside the old bottling plant on Vanderbilt Avenue, holding a paper bag of cat food and a thermos of hot cocoa. She was not sure which one felt more absurd to be carrying. Both, probably. Both felt like things you bring when you are not sure what you are hoping for. Vivienne arrived at exactly 6 p.m., stepping out of a black sedan that looked wildly out of place on the industrial Brooklyn street. She was wearing a long charcoal coat and no makeup, and she looked for the first time since Claire had met her, slightly unsure of herself. "I was not sure you would come," Vivienne said, stopping a few feet away. "I was not sure you would be here," Claire replied. Vivienne's mouth twitched. She looked at the paper bag in Claire's hand, then at the thermos, and something in her expression softened. "You brought supplies?" "I brought cocoa," Claire said. "It's the salted kind, the one from the obituary." The words hung in the think between them. The obituary, the thing they kept circling around, the thing that had somehow become a door instead of a wall. Vivienne did not comment on it. She just turned and walked toward the back of the bottling plant, and Claire followed. The cats were there, as promised, a motley collection of gray and orange and one regal tuxedo cat who watched them approach with visible suspicion. Claire crouched down and opened the bag of food, and within 30 seconds, the suspicion evaporated into a chorus of hungry mees. Vivienne stood back, watching. She did not crouch. She did not approach. She just stood there with her hands in her coat pockets, her shoulders slightly hunched against the evening chill. "Have you done this before?" Claire asked, scattering kibble in a wide arc. "No. You checked on the cats, but you never fed them?" "I wanted to see if they were real," Vivienne said quietly. "The cats, the place you wrote about. Sometimes I think half of Brooklyn is a story someone told me that I never verified." Claire looked up at her. The tuxedo cat was eating from her open palm now, its small pink tongue rough against her skin. "That's the loneliest thing I've ever heard," Claire said, without meaning to say it out loud. Vivienne went very still. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The cats ate. The evening deepened around them. "My mother used to bring me here," Vivienne said suddenly, her voice low and even, like she was reading from a script she had not had to memorize. "When I was small. This was not a bottling plant then. It was a bakery, and she would buy me a roll with sugar on top, and we would sit on the curb and watch the trucks go by." Claire did not move, did not breathe, almost. She knew with the certainty of a woman who wrote obituaries for a living that this was not a story Vivienne told often, maybe had never told anyone. "She died when I was 17, Vivienne continued, her voice catching on the word died in a way she clearly did not intend. "My father told me not to cry at the funeral. He said—" She stopped, swallowed, started again, but the words did not come. She stood there, a formidable woman in a charcoal coat, undone by the memory of a bakery that no longer existed. Claire rose slowly, brushing cat food dust off her jeans. She unscrewed the thermos and poured hot cocoa into the cup top, and then she walked over and held it out to Vivienne with both hands, like an offering. Vivienne looked at the cup, then at Claire. "I don't—" Vivienne started. "You don't have to drink it," Claire said gently. "But you told me something real, and I wanted to give you something warm in return, that's all." Vivienne took the cup. Her fingers brushed Claire's, and neither of them pulled it for a second longer than necessary. She lifted the cup to her lips and drank. The salt hit first, then the sweet, and Claire watched her eyes change. Something cracked there, quietly, like ice letting go of a branch it had held all winter. "This is the first thing anyone has made for me," Vivienne said, her voice hoarse, "since my mother died." She did not cry, but her eyes were wet and she did not look away. And Claire understood that this was the closest Vivienne Ashford had come to crying in 20 years. Claire did not say, "I'm sorry." She did not say, "That's so sad." She just stood there, holding the thermos with both arms, letting the silence be a place to rest instead of a thing to escape. "I mean it," Claire said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The obituary. Every word. Even the parts I didn't write." Vivienne set the empty cup down on the low brick wall beside her. She looked at Claire for a long time, and then she said, very quietly, "I read it again on Sunday. I kept it in my bag. I do not know why I did that." Claire felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. "Maybe," Claire said, "because someone finally told you the truth about yourself and you wanted to keep it close." Vivienne exhaled slowly. The tuxedo cat had finished eating and was now winding around her ankles, and Vivienne looked down at it with the mild, startled expression of a woman who had never once been chosen by a cat. "What do I do with it?" Vivienne asked. She did not mean the cat. "Keep it," Claire said. "Or don't. It's yours either way." The last light drained out of the sky, the cats dispersed into the shadows, and Vivienne Ashford, the ice queen of Manhattan, stood in a crumbling Brooklyn lot with a stray cat at her feet, looking at Claire Bennett like she was a sentence she'd not yet learned to read. "I would like to see you again," Vivienne said, the words coming out sideways like she was not sure she was allowed to say them. "Not to verify facts," Claire smiled. It was a small, brave smile, the kind you wear when something you hoped for quietly comes true. "I would like that too," she said. The story broke on a Tuesday, the way bad news always does. Too early, too loud, and with a headline that left no room for nuance. Ashford Media CEO in death hoax scandal. Self-styled ice queen caught faking her own obit for sympathy. Claire saw it on her phone at 6:47 a.m., still in bed, still half asleep. She read it twice before the words made sense. Then she read it a third time, because the second time had been a mistake. Her own name was in the 5th paragraph, quoted out of think text, pinned like a butterfly to a board she had never agreed to stand on. Sources close to the Ashford family suggest the obituary was a coordinated PR move, the piece read. Author Claire Bennett, a freelance writer with ties to the Brooklyn Ledger, reportedly crafted the emotional tribute at the request of Ashford's inner circle. Claire sat up. Her hands were cold. She had not spoken to Vivienne since the evening at the lot. 4 days ago. 4 days of not calling, not texting, not doing any of the things she had wanted to do. She had told herself it was restraint. She had told herself Vivienne would reach out when she was ready. She had told herself a lot of things, and now the words were on the internet, twisted into something unrecognizable. Her phone buzzed. Then again. Then again. The first text was from Marta. "Do not answer any calls. Do not open any links. I am handling it. You did nothing wrong." The second was from an unknown number, or reporter. The third was from another. The fourth was from her landlord asking if the news was true. Claire put the phone face down on the nightstand and sat very still in the gray morning light, trying to remember how to breathe. By noon, the story had metastasized. It was on every major outlet, every social feed, every talking head segment that needed a villain before the lunch break. The angle had hardened by then, sharpened into something crueler than the original. Vivienne Ashford, the theory went, had orchestrated the entire thing because her company's stock was slipping and she needed sympathy. The obituary was the hook. Claire Bennett was the accomplice. The comments were worse. Claire made the mistake of reading them once, then stopped, because each one was a small knife and she was not as thick-skinned as her writing made her seem. She called in sick to work. She did not tell Marta where she was going. She just put on her coat, walked to the subway, and rode the L train to the end of the line, to a bench by the water where nobody knew her name. She sat there for a long time. She did not cry. She was too tired for that, and too scared. And those were different things, but they occupied the same space in her chest. She thought about Vivienne. She thought about the way Vivienne had looked at her in the lot, like she was a sentence she had not yet learned to read. She thought about the hot cocoa, and the tuxedo cat, and the way Vivienne's voice had cracked on the word mother. She thought about how, 4 days ago, something had felt possible. Now it felt like a door slamming shut. The call came at 4:12 p.m. Claire was still on the bench, coat pulled tight, watching a tugboat drag its slow load across the harbor. Her phone lit up with a number she had saved 3 days ago, telling herself it was for professional reasons. She answered on the first ring. Claire. Vivienne's voice was clipped, precise, the voice she used in boardrooms, the voice she had not used once during their evening at the lot. I need to know if you spoke to anyone. Claire's stomach dropped. What? Did you speak to anyone about the obituary? About our conversations? About anything? A pause, then harder. Did you talk to a reporter? No, of course not, Vivienne. I would never. I am not accusing you, but the words were sharp, too fast, and they did not sound like the truth. I am asking because the information that leaked was specific. It included details from the lot, the hot cocoa, the cats, things only you and I knew. Claire's grip tightened on the phone. She could feel the cold seeping through her jaw. Nanoseconds, through the bench, through everything. I didn't tell anyone, I swear. I don't even know any reporters. That is not what I asked. I'm telling you the truth. There was a long silence on the other end. Claire could hear something in the background, a muffled voice, a door closing. When Vivienne spoke again, her voice was quieter, and that was worse, because it meant she was trying to be careful. I want to believe you, Vivienne said. I do. But this is my company, my name, my father's legacy, and the only person who knew about the lot, about what I told you, is you. Claire opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What was there to say? The logic was airtight. It was all so wrong, but she could not prove that, and she did not know how to fight a fact she had not committed. I would never hurt you, Claire said finally. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. You have to know that. The silence stretched. Somewhere above her a seagull screamed. I thought I did, Vivienne said. I am not sure anymore. The line went dead. Claire lowered the phone and stared at the harbor. The tugboat was gone now, replaced by a container ship, massive and indifferent. She sat very still, letting the wind do what it wanted with her hair, letting the cold settle into her bones. She did not cry. She was too tired for that, and too hurt, and those were different things, but they occupied the same space in her chest. For the second time in one day, she sat alone on a bench by the water, feeling the world collapse around her in slow motion. She did not go home that night. She went to Marta's apartment instead, because Marta had a couch and a bottle of whiskey, and a way of saying terrible things that made them feel survivable. Marta opened the door in sweatpants and a faded t-shirt that said, I write obits for a living. You're next. She took one look at Claire's face and pulled her inside without a word. It wasn't me, Claire said, before Marta could ask. I didn't tell anyone. I swear to God, Marta, I didn't. I know. Marta handed her a glass of whiskey. I already made 3 calls. The leak came from inside Ashford's office. Some junior exec named Delaney trying to curry favor with a rival outlet. It's a mess, and it's not yours. Claire stared at her. How do you know that? Because I'm a journalist, babe. I dig. Marta sat down across from her, eyes sharp. The question is, what are you going to do about the fact that she blamed you before she even asked your side? Claire looked down at the whiskey. She did not drink it. She just held it, letting the glass warm her palms. I don't know, she said. I don't know what I'm supposed to do when the person I trusted decides I'm the enemy without even listening. Marta was quiet for a moment. Then she said, gently, you're allowed to be angry, you know. You don't have to fix this. You don't have to be the bigger person. Claire nodded. She did not say anything. She did not say that she was not angry. She was hurt, and hurt was harder than anger, because anger could be held like a shield, but hurt just sat in her chest like a stone. She thought about Vivienne, the way her voice had sounded when she said, I want to believe you. The way it had cracked on the word believe, like she was trying to convince herself. She thought about the lot, and the cats, and the hot cocoa, and the way Vivienne had looked at her like she was a sentence she had not yet learned to read. She thought about how, 4 days ago, something had felt possible. Now it felt like a door slamming shut, and she was on the wrong side of it, and she did not know how to knock. The next morning, Claire woke up on Marta's couch with a stiff neck and a phone full of notifications. She did not read any of them. She turned off her phone, drank a glass of water, and went back to sleep. She did not reach out to Vivienne, and Vivienne did not reach out to her. The silence stretched between them like a wound that neither of them knew how to dress. The first cup appeared on a Tuesday. The doorman, a man named Reyes, who had worked the morning shift for 11 years, found it on the small ledge beside the entrance, just under the awning where the rain could not reach it. A paper cup, the kind from the diner on the corner of 63rd and Lex, with a lid pressed on tight and a napkin tucked underneath. He picked it up. It was still warm. Inside the diner's cardboard sleeve, written in careful blue ink on the napkin, were 2 words. For Vivienne. Reyes did not know what to do with it. He brought it upstairs to the penthouse, where the housekeeper looked at it with suspicion, then at him with the same suspicion. In the end, they left it on the kitchen counter, where Vivienne found it on her way to her first meeting of the day. She stared at it for a long moment. She did not open it. She did not throw it away. She simply looked at the 2 words on the napkin, recognized the handwriting, and felt something twist in her chest that she refused to name. She left the cup on the counter and went to work. The second cup appeared on Wednesday. Same ledge, same diner sleeve, same careful blue ink. This time Reyes did not bring it upstairs. He left it on the ledge, watching it from the lobby window, wondering if the person who left it would come back. No one came back. The cup sat there for an hour, then 2, then 3. The coffee inside went cold. At noon, Reyes threw it away. But on Thursday there was another one, and on Friday another. By Saturday, Reyes had stopped throwing them away. He had started leaving them on the ledge, lined up in a neat row like small ceramic soldiers guarding the entrance. He did not know why he did it. He only knew that whoever was leaving these cups was not trying to be seen, and that felt like something worth respecting. Vivienne noticed, of course. She noticed everything, even the things she pretended not to see. She noticed the cups appearing on the ledge. She noticed that they were always the same kind, always from the same diner, always with the same 2 words written in the same careful blue ink. She noticed that Reyes had stopped bringing them upstairs, and that he had started looking at her with a strange, quiet expression, like he was keeping a secret she was not ready to hear. She did not ask about the cups. She did not acknowledge them. She walked past them every morning, her heels clicking against the marble floor of the lobby, her eyes fixed straight ahead, her jaw tight. But she did not tell Reyes to throw them away. That was the thing. She did not tell anyone to throw them away. And every evening, when she came home, she stood at the window of her penthouse, looking down at the street, watching the small paper cup sit on the ledge like a question she was too afraid to answer. On Sunday, it rained. Claire stood across the street, under the awning of a closed bakery, holding the 4th cup of hot cocoa she had made that morning. Her hands were cold. The rain had soaked through her sneakers, and her hair was plastered to her forehead, and she had been standing there for 20 minutes, waiting for the doorman to look away so she could Having done the course, she did not know why she kept doing this. She had told herself it was about the obituary, about the apology she owed, about the fact that she had written something that had hurt someone, even if she had not meant to. She had told herself that this was not about Vivienne, not really. It was about doing the right thing, about making amends, about being the kind of person who did not disappear when things got hard. But standing in the rain, with the cocoa growing cold in her hands, she knew that was a lie. This was about Vivienne. It had been about Vivienne since the moment she had walked into the newsroom, alive and furious and more beautiful than any obituary could ever capture. Claire closed her eyes. She counted to 10. Then she crossed the street, set the cup on the ledge, and walked away without looking back. On Monday, the 7th day, the cup was still there when Vivienne came down. She had not slept. She had spent the night rereading the obituary, the one Claire had written, the one that had started all of this. She had read it so many times that she knew it by heart. Every word, every pause, every careful, tender sentence. She had read the part about the birthday cake, about the dock and the cold, and the girl who had eaten an entire cake alone because she had not known how to ask anyone to stay. She had read the part about loneliness, about how it shaped people, how it made them strong in ways that no one else could see. And she had realized, with a clarity that felt like a blade, that Claire had not been writing about the woman the world knew. She had been writing about the girl Vivienne had been, the girl she had buried so deep that she had almost forgotten she existed. Vivienne stood in the lobby, looking at the cup on the ledge. Rain was still falling, the cup was wet, the cardboard soft at the edges, the napkins soaked through. But the words were still visible, bleeding slightly into the paper, still unmistakably Claire's handwriting. For Vivienne. She picked it up. It was cold. The cocoa had long since gone cold, and the cup was limp in her hand, and there was no one standing across the street, no one waiting to see if she would take it. She stood there for a long time, holding the cold cup, feeling the rain soak through her coat, feeling something crack in the careful armor she had built around herself. She did not cry. She had not cried in 19 years. But she stood there, in the rain, holding a cold cup of cocoa that someone had left for her, and she felt the crack widen. She brought the cup upstairs. She set it on her desk, next to the old typewriter she never let anyone touch. She did not throw it away. And for the first time in 7 days, she picked up her phone. The call came at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning, and Vivienne answered it before the second ring. She had been awake since 5, sitting at her desk with the cold cup of cocoa still sitting beside the typewriter, the napkin with Claire's handwriting pressed flat and dry on the blotter. It was Harold Finch, the chairman of the board. His voice was clipped, lawyerly, the way it always was when he was about to deliver an ultimatum disguised as a suggestion. "Vivienne, we have a problem. The Post is running a piece tomorrow alleging you manufactured the obituary situation for sympathy. They have sources inside your own building." She closed her eyes. Of course they did. "We need you to issue a statement," Harold continued. "The board has drafted language that clarifies you had no involvement and that the writer acted unilaterally. We need her to issue glone, think, failen, spale, and did something a public apology as well? It's the only way to contain this." Vivienne looked at the napkin on her desk. "For Vivienne." "Harold," she said quietly, "I haven't agreed to any statement. You will? The board meeting is at 10. We expect you to sign off on the language by noon, and we've scheduled a press conference for 3 p.m. at the office. This is not a negotiation, Vivienne. This is damage control." The line went dead. Vivienne sat very still for a long moment. Then she stood up, walked to the window, and looked down at the street where a girl in a cream-colored sweater had stood in the rain for 20 minutes, holding a cup of cocoa that she left for someone who had accused her of betrayal. She did not call the writer. She did not call her lawyer. She called Marta Delgado instead. A number she had looked up the night before and memorized because she did not trust herself to type it. "Miss Delgado," she said when the editor answered, "this is Vivienne Ashford. I need to ask you a question, and I need you to answer it honestly." There was a pause. "I know who you are. What do you want?" "Did Claire Bennett leak any information about the obituary to anyone?" Another pause, longer this time. "No. I checked. It was someone on your side.
a junior PR associate who sold the story to the Post. Claire didn't even know the piece was running until I told her. Vivienne's grip on the phone tightened. "Thank you." "Ms. Ashford," Marta said, and there was something sharp in her voice now, something protective. "Claire is a good person. She writes dead people's stories for a living because she thinks no one wants to read about the living. But she cares. She cares too much, and it gets her hurt. If you're going to use her as a scapegoat, at least have the decency to do it to her face."
Think. Vivienne said nothing for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "I have no intention of doing that." She hung up and stood at the window for a long time, watching the city wake up below her, watching the rain from yesterday dry into pale gray light. By noon, she had not signed the statement. By 1, Harold had called 3 times. By 2, the conference room was full of cameras and microphones, and the board was seated in the front row like a jury. Vivienne stood behind the podium, her hands resting on the edges of the wooden lectern, looking at the sea of expectant faces. The teleprompter displayed the prepared remarks, the statement Harold had drafted, the one that named Claire Bennett as the sole responsible party, the one that would clear the Ashford name and bury the writer who had only ever tried to see her. She looked at the words on the screen. Then she looked away. "Thank you for coming," she said, and her voice carried through the room, calm and steady. "I have a statement to make regarding the recent obituary that was published in error." She paused. The room was silent. "I didn't write that obituary," she said, "but I read it. I read it many times, in fact, and I want to tell you what I found in it." Harold shifted in his seat. A reporter leaned forward. "The writer of that piece did not know me. She had never met me. She wrote about me from research, from public records, from the things that are easy to find about a person. But somewhere in that research, she found something that wasn't in any press release. She found a detail about a birthday cake, eaten alone on a dock 20 years ago. A detail I never told anyone." Her voice caught, just slightly. She steadied it. "That detail was true, and the woman who wrote it had no way of knowing it was true. He couldn't have found it in any archive. She found it because she paid attention to the shape of a person's life, not the headlines. She wrote about me like I was a human being, and I have spent the last 19 years making sure no one could do that." The room was utterly silent now. Even Harold had stopped shifting. "So no," she said, and her voice was quiet, but it carried. "I will not be issuing a statement that places blame on her. I will not be asking her to apologize for writing something that was kind. And if anyone in this room, or in my building, or in this industry, tries to use that mistake to hurt her, they will answer to me." She stepped back from the podium. "Thank you. That will be all." The room erupted. Cameras flashed. Voices called out questions. But Vivienne was already walking away, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her face unreadable. She did not look at the board. She did not look at Harold. She walked out of the conference room, down the hall, into her office, and closed the door. Then she stood very still in the center of the room, her hands shaking slightly, and she realized she had just done something she had never done before. She had chosen someone else over the armor she had spent 19 years building. She did not know yet what that meant, but she knew she had meant every word. In a small apartment in Brooklyn, Claire sat on her couch in her cream-colored sweater, a bowl of cold soup untouched on the coffee table, watching the press conference on a screen that felt impossibly distant. When Vivienne said the words, "She wrote about me like I was a human being," Claire's breath caught in her throat. When Vivienne said, "They will answer to me," Claire pressed her hand to her mouth, and when the broadcast ended, she sat in the silence of her apartment, surrounded by old newspapers and the faint smell of cocoa that had long since gone cold, and she felt something she had been holding very carefully begin to crack open inside her. She did not have Vivienne's phone number, but she knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that she needed to see her. That night, Claire walked to the Brooklyn Bridge. She stood at the railing, looking out at the Manhattan skyline, the lights of the city reflecting on the dark water below her. She thought about the first day she had seen Vivienne Ashford, alive and furious in the newsroom doorway, a walking correction to every word Claire had written about her. She thought about the birthday cake on the dock and the girl who had eaten it alone and the woman who had just stood in front of a room full of cameras and said that Claire had written about her like she was a human being. She thought about the cocoa she had left every morning for 7 days, and the cup she had watched from across the street, and the way her heart had hurt every time she saw it still sitting there untouched. And then her phone buzzed. The screen leapt at the number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, but something made her reach for it, something that felt like the last crack in a wall she had been building around herself for a very long time. Hello? There was a pause. Then a voice, low and careful, a voice she had only heard on television and in her own head for weeks now. "Claire, it's Vivienne. I need to see you. Can you meet me at the bridge?" Claire's hand tightened on the phone. The wind off the river was cold, and the city hummed around her, and somewhere far below the lights of Manhattan shimmered like 1,000 unanswered questions. She looked at the bridge in thanked of her, the same bridge she had stood on 100 times, and she said, softly, "I'm already here." There was a long pause. Then Vivienne said, "I'm on my way," and the line went dead. Claire stood at the railing, her heart beating fast and loud in her chest, and she waited. She did not know what would happen next. She did not know if this was the beginning of something, or the end of something, or just a moment in the middle that would change everything. But she knew, with a certainty that felt like the first true thing she had believed in a long time, that she did not want to be anywhere else. The Brooklyn Bridge at midnight was a different creature than the one Claire knew by day. The tourists were gone, the vendors packed up, and the steel cables hummed a low, constant note against the wind off the East River. Claire stood at the railing, her cream-colored coat pulled tight, and watched the lights of Manhattan flicker like they were trying to tell her something she wasn't ready to hear. She heard footsteps before she saw her, slow, deliberate, the click of heels on concrete that didn't hurry and didn't apologize. Claire turned, and there was Vivienne Ashford, walking toward her across the bridge in a charcoal coat with her hair loose around her shoulders. No assistant, no lawyer, no armor. Vivienne stopped a few feet away and looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of salt and river water and something else, something fragile. "You came," Claire said, and her voice came out softer than she meant it to. "You said you were already here." Vivienne's voice was quiet, too, stripped of the boardroom edge. She took a step closer. "I've been thinking about what to say to you for 3 days. I wrote it out in my head 100 times. I even typed it on the old typewriter, which is ridiculous because I haven't done that since I was 17. Claire's chest tightened. "What did you write?" "I wrote 'I'm sorry' about 60 different ways, and none of them felt like enough." Vivienne's hands were in her pockets, and her shoulders were curved just slightly inward, the way they were in the photos from years ago, before she became the Ice Queen. "So I decided to stop writing and just tell you the truth." She moved to the rail beside Claire, close enough that their elbows almost touched. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The city hummed below them, indifferent and enormous. "My mother died when I was 17, Vivienne said finally. Her voice was steady, but Claire could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. "She was sick for a year before that, and I spent that year pretending everything was fine. I got perfect grades, I ran the school newspaper, I took care of my father's business correspondence because he couldn't face it. I was so good at pretending that no one noticed I was falling apart." Claire didn't move. She didn't reach out. She just listened, the way she had learned to listen to the families of the dead, with her whole body quiet and open. "The night she died, my father sat me down in his study and told me that Ashfords don't cry, that we don't show weakness, because the world will eat us alive if we do. He said I was the heir now, and I had to be strong for the family name." Vivienne's jaw tightened. "I was 17 years old, and I had just watched my mother take her last breath, and I was not allowed to cry." The wind picked up, and Claire watched Vivienne's hair move across her face. She did not brush it away. "So I didn't cry. I locked it all up. The grief and the thing and the loneliness, and I threw away the key. I built a company. I built a reputation. I built a life where no one could get close enough to see that the lock was rusted shut from the inside." Vivienne's voice cracked, just barely, on the last word. "And then you wrote that obituary." Claire's breath caught. "You wrote about the birthday cake," Vivienne said, and her voice was barely above a whisper now. "I don't know how you found that. I never told anyone.
But you wrote that I know the weight of loneliness because I have carried it since I was young, and you wrote it like it was not a weakness, like it was something that made me human instead of broken. I wrote it because it was true, Claire said softly. I found an old interview from your first company launch. You mentioned, almost as an aside, that you spent your 21st birthday alone on the pier because you had just lost everything, and you didn't want anyone to see you fall apart. And I thought about what that must have felt like. I thought about how hard it must have been to eat a whole cake by yourself and pretend you were fine. Vivienne turned to face her, and Claire saw that her eyes were bright, shining with something that had been held back for 19 years. Nobody ever saw that, Vivienne said. Nobody ever looked at me and saw the girl who ate a birthday cake alone because she didn't know how to ask for help. They saw the CEO. They saw the Ashford name. They saw the ice queen. She took a shaky breath. You saw me. You wrote about me like I was a person, not a headline. And I didn't know how to handle that, so I got angry. I blamed you. I pushed you away because you were the first person in 19 years who made me feel like I didn't have to be perfect to be worthy of being written about.
Claire's eyes filled with tears. She didn't wipe them away. I'm sorry, Vivienne said, and the words came out raw and broken. I'm sorry I accused you. I'm sorry I made you feel like your kindness was a mistake. I'm sorry I waited until the whole world was watching to say what I should have said to you alone. She swallowed hard. I was scared. I am scared. I don't know how to let someone see me and not run. Claire reached out and took Vivienne's hand. Her fingers were cold and they trembled slightly, and Claire held them gently, the way you would hold something fragile and precious. You don't have to be perfect for me, Claire said. I didn't write that obituary because you were impressive. I wrote it because I saw a person who was lonely, and I wanted her to know that someone noticed, that someone cared. She squeezed Vivienne's hand. You don't need to be strong all the time, Vivienne. You don't need to carry it all alone. You're allowed to fall apart. You're allowed to be human. Vivienne's breath caught, and then the tears came. They came silently at first, sliding down her cheeks, and then in great shaking sobs that she tried to muffle with her free hand. Claire stepped closer and wrapped her arms around her, pulling her into an embrace that was warm and solid and unafraid. It's okay, Claire murmured against her hair. I've got you. It's okay. Vivienne cried for a long time, her face pressed into Claire's shoulder, her body shaking with 19 years of held-back grief. And Claire held her, steady and sure, the way she had always wanted someone to hold her. Thank you, Vivienne finally whispered, her voice hoarse. Thank you for seeing me. Claire pulled back just enough to look at her. Vivienne's mascara was smudged, and her nose was red, and Hector's
think never looked more beautiful to Claire than in that moment, raw and real and completely unguarded. You don't have to thank me, Claire said. You just have to let me stay. Vivienne laughed, a wet, shaky sound. I think I can manage that. They stood there for a long time, on the bridge with the city glittering around them and the wind carrying their words away into the night. And for the first time in 19 years, Vivienne Ashford did not feel like she was alone. Claire reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small thermos. She unscrewed the cap and handed it to Vivienne. What's this? Vivienne asked. Hot cocoa with salt, Claire said, and her smile was soft. I figured you might need it. Vivienne stared at the thermos, and then at Claire, and then she drank. The warmth spread through her chest, and the salt was just right, and she felt something in her loosen, like a knot that had been tied too tight for too long finally coming undone. It's perfect, she said, and she meant it. Claire's smile widened. I mean it, she said. Every word of it. And standing there on the Brooklyn Bridge, with the night wrapping around them like a shared secret, Vivienne Ashford finally let herself believe that she was allowed to be loved. 3 months later, autumn had settled over Brooklyn like a familiar blanket, all amber light and the smell of fallen leaves. Claire Bennett stood in her tiny apartment, staring at the printed proof of her very first column for the Brooklyn Ledger, and her hands would not stop shaking. Marta Delgado leaned against the doorframe, holding her ever-present bottle of hot sauce like a talisman. "Babe, if you stare at it any longer, the ink is going to catch fire." "I just can't believe it's real," Claire said, her voice barely a bit a whisper.
Diary. They actually gave me a column. A living column. A column about living people for which you will write about people who are actually, alive. Revolutionary concept. Marta grinned and took a long swig straight from the bottle. "You earned it. That piece you wrote about the old barber in Greenpoint who still shines shoes for free? I got 3 calls from other editors asking who wrote it." Claire finally looked up and her eyes were wet. "I wrote about Vivienne first, though." Marta's grin softened into something rare and genuine. "I know, and that's the bravest thing you've ever done." The column was called The Living, and it was dedicated to people who were very much alive but rarely seen. The first installment was about Vivienne Ashford, not the ice queen of Manhattan, not the CEO of a media empire, but the girl who once ate an entire birthday cake alone on a pier because she didn't know how to ask anyone to sit with her. Claire had written it with the same tenderness she had poured into the obituary that started everything. But this time, there was no mistake. This time, it was a love letter in broad daylight. Vivienne read it at her desk on a Tuesday morning, and she did not cry. But she did close her office door, which she almost never did, and she read it twice, and then a third time, and she pressed her palm flat against the page as if she could feel the warmth of the words through the paper. That afternoon, a courier arrived at Claire's apartment with a box that was heavy and carefully wrapped. Inside was an old typewriter, the exact model Claire had admired in Vivienne's office that night they stayed late talking about childhoods and loneliness and the weight of being seen. There was a note tucked under the keys, written in Vivienne's sharp, elegant handwriting. "Claire, you wrote my obituary by mistake, and it was the truest thing anyone has ever written about me. But I am so glad you were wrong. I am so glad I am alive to read this. You write about the living now, and I want you to know because of you I am actually living." This typewriter was my mother's. She used it to write letters she never sent. I want you to have it so you can write the things the world needs to hear. You make the world softer, Claire. I mean it. Claire read the note 5 times, and then she sat down on her floor surrounded by packing paper and old keys, and she cried the way Vivienne had cried on the bridge that night, not from sadness, from the sheer, overwhelming relief of being believed in. They met at the Brooklyn Bridge at sunset, because that was where they had become real to each other, and it felt right to return there. The sky was a wash of orange and pink, and the city hummed below them, indifferent and beautiful. Vivienne was standing at the railing, hands in the pockets of her long coat, and when she turned to see Claire walking toward her, her face did something Claire had never seen before. It softened, completely. All the sharp edges, all the careful armor, all of it just melted away. "You got my note," Vivienne said. "I did." Claire stopped beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Your mother's typewriter." "Vivienne, I can't accept that. It's exactly the right amount." Vivienne turned to face her fully. "You gave me something I didn't know I was allowed to have. You made me feel like a person instead of a monument. That's worth more than any typewriter." Claire's breath caught. "The column, did you—" "I read it 3 times. Vivienne's voice was quiet, almost shy. "No one has ever written about me like that, like I was just a person, like I was worth writing about for being alive, not for being powerful." "You are worth writing about," Claire said, and her voice was firm, the way it only got when she meant something absolutely. "You are worth writing about for the way you tap your fingers on your desk when you're thinking. For the way you drink hot cocoa with salt even though you pretend you don't like it. For the way you stayed on this bridge with me when you could have walked away. You are worth writing about, Vivienne. Not because you're CEO, because you're you." Vivienne looked at her for a long moment, and then she did something Claire had never seen her do. She laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a measured corporate laugh, but a real one, bright and unguarded, the kind that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "You wrote me an obituary," Vivienne said, shaking her head, "and it turned out to be the beginning of my life." Claire laughed, too, and the sound mixed with the wind and the distant traffic and the river moving below them.
"I wrote you an obituary by mistake," she said, "but I'd rather write you a life." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and golden in the fading light. Vivienne reached out and took Claire's hand. Her fingers were cool, but they held on with a gentle firmness that said everything her voice couldn't. "I want you to write my life, Claire. Every chapter. The boring parts, the messy parts, the parts where I'm not at my best. I want you to see all of it, and I want you to stay." Claire squeezed her hand back. "I'm not going anywhere. I mean it." They stood there as the sun sank lower, painting the river in shades of amber and rose. The city went about its business around them, but they were in their own small pocket
Of quiet. Two people who had found each other through a mistake that turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to either of them. "I never told you," Vivienne said after a while, "what I did with your apology letter, the one you left at my front desk, with the corrected version of the obituary." Claire looked up. "I always wondered. I kept it. I read it whenever I felt like I was drowning in expectations. You wrote that I was still here, still glowing, still worthy of being celebrated for the life I am living. I didn't believe it at first, but I read it so many times that eventually I started to— because it was true," Claire said simply. "Because you made it true." Vivienne turned to her, and the last light of the sun caught her face. "You saw me, Claire. Not the title, not the empire, me. And you didn't run." "Why would I run?" Claire asked, and her voice was soft like she was telling a secret. "I finally found someone worth staying for." Vivienne's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing Claire had ever seen. "Come on," Claire said, tugging her gently toward the path. "There's a diner in Dumbo that makes the best hot cocoa in Brooklyn. I'll order it with salt and you can pretend to be offended, and then we'll share it." "That sounds perfect," Vivienne said. "It will be," Claire promised, "because I'm going to be there with you, and that's the only thing that matters." They walked off the bridge together, hand in hand, into the amber dusk of a city that had finally started to feel like home. Behind them, the river glittered, and the lights of Manhattan began to flicker on, one by one, like small, warm promises. Claire Bennett had written an obituary by mistake, but what she had really done was write hers. Think a future, and a woman who was no longer a monument, and a love story that had started with a deadline and ended with a lifetime. And somewhere in the Brooklyn night, in a small diner with a red awning and a waitress who called everyone on, two women sat across from each other, sharing a cup of hot cocoa with salt and laughing at nothing in particular. It was, Vivienne thought, the best mistake she had ever been part of, and it was only the beginning.
That mistaken obituary didn't mark the end of her life, but the beautiful beginning of ours. Sometimes, the greatest love stories start with the biggest mistakes. Thank you for letting me share our journey with you. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know your city in the comments below.